So I have my 100-year-old grandmother visiting right now. So I've was just giving her lunch and thought, I better just go in and make sure all my ducks are in a row for this class. And so I'm glad I did. Yes, I am a biblical scholar and a permaculture farmer, and quit full-time academia over 15 years ago now, because I realized that a lot of what I was teaching, it was very difficult to implement in my life in terms of nurturing community, caring for creation with full-time academic work going on. I also realized that I like being outside a lot more than I like being behind a desk. So that's part of the reason I thought, you know what, maybe I could do this part-time. We live on a 50-acre permaculture farm, and I'm going to say more about that because when Mark asked me to do this, the first word in his request was to talk about your farm. So I've got a bunch of pictures at the end that will say more about the farm and how it ties in with what we're doing. I'm going to start with biblical stuff, and then. I also have just started a new venture called Bible Remixed. And this is a teaching that I'll be doing at first largely online. And it's the two courses I'm offering first. The first one's called A Life-Giving Story, How to Read the Bible. I realize the subtitle isn't that exciting. I should have called it A Life-Giving Story, The Bible as Resistance, Literature, something like that. And that one actually starts tonight, not next week. So it starts at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this evening. And the other one is called Reading the Bible from the Margins. And that will be a 4-week course in Lent. And you can go to our new website. I've just thrown web design into my new skill set called, it's at www.bibleremixed.ca. So just remember, it's a Canadian course. So it's a website, it's called CA. So yeah, that's a little bit of who I am. I'm attend an Anglican church, and I am also the co-chair of the Bishop's Committee on Creation Care in the Diocese of Toronto. So if you work on something long enough, you get volunteered to do even more with it. So, and that's a special committee that our Bishop Andrew Asbill started a number of years ago. And we're doing a lot of work around resources and liturgy connected to that committee. So let me begin. There's sort of 3 parts to what I'll be doing. I'm gonna be talking about the Bible, and particularly, we're going to run through the Bible a little bit quickly. I already felt like I had a fair bit that I was doing, and now I came a little late, so we'll see how we do with that. We're gonna run quickly through a number of biblical stories, and then I'm going to say something about industrial farming, and then we'll talk about. I'll show some slides from our farm and talk about the kind of farming that we do here in this place, and why we do what we do, and hopefully that'll all round together at a certain point. So let me start with, and I just need to ask whoever's doing the tech, am I able to share my screen? I assume I am. I'm going to try it. Okay, I cannot at the moment. So is there somebody there doing tech who can enable that?
Yes, Kelsey, I think is going to give you the share screen capability.
Great.
I think you're okay right now.
Okay. Yeah, there I am. Okay, great. Okay. So this is just a slide of the talk. I'm gonna start with actually I want this slide first. I want to start with just pointing out the worldview questions that shape a little bit about what I'm going to be doing. There's there's a book published actually by my husband a long time ago called Transforming Vision, which talks about these questions that everybody answers in a fundamental way about what kind of a world we're in, and who we are in that world, and what's wrong with the world, and what the remedy is for the world. And how we answer those questions constitutes our worldview. And so how we answer those questions in relation to creation has a lot to do with how we view the agriculture that we do, the farming that we do. And so if we answer those questions in terms of a story of violence, or if we answer those questions in a story of abundance and harmony, that will make a difference as to how we treat creation. And that will make a difference as to how we get our food, and how we farm. So let's see if I can go back a slide here. This is, I'm going to say something about the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation story. And this is the creation story that ancient Israelites would have heard at the time that Genesis 1 and 2 was written down. It was likely written down during the exile, which isn't to say that those traditions, those oral traditions, had not been around for a very long time and had been passed down within the community of those who followed Yahweh. But at the time that they committed those traditions to writing, this was the story that surrounded them. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, is a story where the god Marduk defeats Tiamat, the mother of the gods, in a cosmic battle. Her body is cut in two, and that becomes the sky and the earth. So half of her body is the sky, I'll get it on your screen here, and the other half is the earth. Her pierced eyes are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Now, human beings, sorry, my slides are a little out of order here. Human beings are the result of her husband, King U, who led a rebellion, being cut up to make human beings. And they are slaves to work the land and feed the gods. And actually, the gods had said to themselves, oh my goodness, we've got this world now, and we don't want to have to do the hard work of getting food. So let's find a way to create other creatures who will look after food for us. And that's why they cut up King U. And actually, we have a depiction of this. This is a Warwick and Uruk vase. And at the top, and I'm going to show the top a little closer, is the Sumerian goddess Iana. And this vase shows the hierarchy of the natural order. So you'll notice on the bottom are plants. A little above that are animals. A little above that are human beings bringing baskets of food. And up at the top is somebody giving a basket of food to the goddess at the temple. So here you can see it a little bit closer. Here's the human beings carrying food for the goddess, right? This is the hierarchy of natural things. Here she is at the top receiving the food, and those two palm shapes, those two like they look like fronds that are about to unfold. Those are the right here. Those are the doors, the lintels to her storehouse. So that's where that food is going to go. And of course, this view of this hierarchical view of the world was seen in the very architecture in the ancient Near East. So Babylonian architecture had these ziggurats that had all these layers, and that ended with this shrine to the gods at the top. And this, incidentally, is probably what the Tower of Babel looked like, right? It was a tower built up to the heavens to reach the gods. This is what the ancient Near Eastern towers to reach the gods looked like. So in that view of the world, people are slaves. Only the priests are the image of God. And the world is created out of violence. Violence goes all the way down in creation, in this kind of a worldview. Well, the biblical worldview is very, very different. The biblical worldview, I'll just stop sharing for a moment. If you just imagine the story, right? If you close your eyes and imagine the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the deep or over the waters, right? And then again and again in the story, we hear these words, and God spoke. Right? And God separated the dry land from the water, and God put the stars into the sky to rule over the day and the night. And at the end of every day, God said, it is good. It is good. Tov, tov, tov. It's great. It's great. It's like that incredible feeling when when you've made something absolutely, a very beautiful meal and you've put it on the table and you look at it and you think, oh, this is great. Gee, that's kind of a terrible thing to say right now, isn't it? It's in the middle of COVID and none of us have served a meal to a whole lot of friends for a long time. But if we had, that feeling of incredible satisfaction. Or if you're an artist or you create things, right? That feeling of, oh, this is good. That's what we have throughout creation, the creation narrative. And it is a narrative in which there is incredible diversity, right? God creates all these plants and then calls the earth to bring forth all kinds of living creatures, and then calls the waters to bring forth all kinds of living creatures, and then the birds in the sky. And there is incredible diversity. So if we're imaging, and I'm going to be showing pictures that kind of show my context. If we were thinking of what it looked like when God created, it would be things like the black bear and the fox and I'm having a complete blank on this creature in the muskrat and the deer. It would be the beaver and the lynx and the wolf and the pine marten. It would be all these incredible birds like the northern flicker and the waxwing and the oriole and the bluebird. And it would be the goldfinch and the bobolink. This one in the top middle is a fledgling bobolink that I took in our field this summer. And I only knew what it was because he was making the same sound as all the immature bobolinks in our field. He's standing on a tree that we planted a number of years ago. And the red-breasted grosbeak, which my kids call the vampire bird, which says probably too much about what they've read. And here, this is a Savannah Sparrow. The Savannah Sparrow, which is starting to go extinct up here. It's a world with incredible bugs. All of these were actually taken in on our property this year, of the northern amber bumblebee and the black belted in the top right corner there, and the 7-spotted ladybug, and the asparagus beetle, who's looking up at the top of that stem for some of my asparagus. And he's only a bed away, so he's going to find it. And a fly and a peony, and all the spiders and skippers and grasshoppers. These are also taken on my property as well. And then all the amphibians. These are also from our farm. The wood frog, who has a little mask, and the leopard frog, and the turtle, and the blue-spotted salamander, and all the flowers and plants. It's an incredible, diverse creation. When it talks about the garden in Genesis 1, we often have a picture of some kind of cultivated garden, right? But it's clear from Genesis 2 that what God planted mostly was trees in this garden, trees that were for fruit. So this is a food forest that has all kinds of trees that are good for food, good to eat. And then God creates human beings. And then God says, if you look down to verse 29 here, God said, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth and every bird of the air and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so, and God saw everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good. What's very good is that this is an abundant creation that has food for everyone, right? Every plant yielding seed, and actually the Hebrew is every seed-bearing plant that has seed, and every fruit with seed in it. Seed gets kind of repeated a lot. In other words, God's given us the seed supply to care for. And if we care for it, we will have food, right? That's one of the first things God says for us. And it's also for every animal that creeps upon the earth. I mean, if you go to Psalm 104, you will find a litany of all the things that God has created for other creatures, right? The mountains for the goats, and the caves for the rock badgers, and the trees for the nests of the birds. And then he talks about the food. The psalmist talks about the food that is for each of these creatures. It is clear that it isn't all for human beings, right? This is a creation to be shared with all of these other creatures. And I have this kind of corny picture. I try not to show pictures where everybody's white in them, but this is one of the few I could find that had a river running through a forest, which I think is what the garden looks like. So the story of Genesis 1, creation is not a result of violence. Unlike Enuma Elish, human beings are the image of God, not the priests. Abundance is to be shared with human beings and all other creatures. And such abundance is a gift. God gives it to us as a gift. We don't have to do anything for it. We don't have to slave for it. It is just a gift. And we are called to maintain the seed supply, right? Now, then we get Genesis chapter 2. And in Genesis chapter 2, God bends down. God's got dirt under God's fingernails by the end of this chapter. God bends down into the soil and creates Adam from Adamah. Adam is literally earth creature, from the earth. Adamah is earth. And God bends down into the soil, creates human beings from the earth, and then puts the human beings in this garden that God has planted trees. It says God caused trees to come up out of the earth, and human beings are put in there. Usually we say to till and to keep, but a better translation is to serve and observe. And then it says that God created all the other creatures out of the earth, not just human beings, but all of us, so that we are all kin with the other creatures. And in fact, when in the story of the flood, when it talks about all the other creatures leaving the ark, it says all the families of the earth to refer to the animals, right? Human beings aren't the only families on the earth. And then Genesis 2 has this called serve and observe creation. So by the time we get to the end of Genesis 1 and 2, and this is probably what the forest looked like here before contact, before settlers came. God's original plan was to hang out by the river in a forest with a whole bunch of bugs, animals, birds, and fish, and a couple of naked vegetarians. That's what God wanted to do. That's God's original plan. I sometimes think God's plan B was to come to earth and hang out with a bunch of outcasts and sinners. That's God's plan B. And there's an end of the story plan too that we're gonna see as well. So I sometimes put this sign on when I go to climate marches and stuff. I sometimes put a shortened version on this. God's original plan was to hang out in a garden with a couple of naked vegetarians, and which means I get in a lot of photos. People like to take pictures of me with that one. So this is what it looked like, a place of abundance with all these animals. This is by a Haitian artist. I think it's really important when certain parts of the world are in crisis for us to be reminded that Haiti is not just a place of earthquakes and refugees and devastation, but there's a whole culture, a whole flourishing culture that never makes our news. So this picture of the garden and all the fruit, I love the watermelon kind of hanging up in the tree there, by this Haitian artist, Gabriel Alex. So here's the contrast. The imperial story is rooted in violence. The biblical story rooted in God's delight. Imperial story, human beings are slaves. Biblical story, human beings are an image of God. The imperial story, abundance is the result of hard labor. Biblical story, abundance is a gift. Imperial story, human beings are meant to serve the gods. Biblical story, human beings are meant to serve God and the land. Imperial story, all creatures are in a hierarchy. Biblical story, all creatures are kin. Imperial story, creation is meant to serve creation. It's not just human beings, but all of creation is meant to serve the needs of the God. And the biblical story, creation is a gift where all creatures live in relationship. It doesn't take too much of a stretch to see that our culture is rooted in that imperial story, right? Abundance in our culture is the result of hard labor, is it not? What's the myth of our culture as to why poverty exists? Well, people aren't working hard enough, right? That's the myth of our culture. Most human beings in our culture are created, not just, this isn't just racially linked, though that's a huge part of it, that certain races in our culture are meant to serve white people. But also there's a class distinction, right? Certain people are meant to do the grunt work for the wealthy in our culture, right? That's why they deserve to make so much more money. All creatures are in a hierarchy in our culture. Human beings are at the top of the creaturely ladder. So the needs of human beings always trump the needs of animals. And as we'll see later, the needs of grasshoppers in Montana. I'll say something about that later. Even creation is meant to serve the needs, not just of all human beings, but the elite. That's what creation is for. Now, here's what happens next in the story. Genesis 3, a radical culinary indiscretion, as my calls it. Also known as eating out of season. Adam and Eve ate out of season. They were told by God that there was this tree, and this tree that would be given to them. Well, it doesn't say it would be given to them, but this tree that they should not eat from because it contained the knowledge of good and evil. And in the story, all through the biblical story, their meals are almost always at the center of God telling some people something about how they should live, something about how God is, right? So God comes and has a meal with Abraham at his tent, and that's when he tells him he's going to have a son, right? Jesus feeds people. Manna in the wilderness is how people find out who God is. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So I have no doubt but that God intended to tell people about what it was to eat faith, what it was to recognize good and evil. God intended to show what that wisdom was around good and evil in due time when they ate from that tree. But Adam and Eve just took the fruit when they shouldn't have. It probably wasn't an apple, even though this picture shows an apple. I like this picture a lot because I like the expressions, particularly on Adam's face. Like, well, if you say it's good, it's probably good, And this is where the story starts to spiral down. The whole rest of the biblical story is God trying to undo what happened here. And a lot of what we see in the biblical story is a distortion of how food and the food supply is handled throughout the story. A lot, as I said, a lot of what God does is around food. So for instance, and I'm just picking up some random examples, I teach a course that talks about a lot of this stuff. This is ancient Egyptian harvesting practices. This is what the Israelites were doing in ancient Egypt. They were the ones harvesting the wheat, as you could see at the top of the picture on your right. You'll notice men with raised sticks here. Those raised sticks in the second from the top one are directed at the slaves, right? You see the slaves carrying the food. You see them stacking it up. The Israelites, it says, were the ones doing the field labor and putting the food into the storehouses. And you'll notice at the bottom of the picture, the one on your left, an Egyptian administrator tallying up all the food that is brought in. We know all this from ancient Egypt, not only because they left pictures, but they left detailed documents that show how much food was brought in, where it went, like all cultures that control every iota of those who are slaves. They wrote every single thing down. In the middle of that, there was this famine, if you know the story of Joseph. And Joseph told Pharaoh that he was going to that he should collect food during 7 years of famine, so there would be food during during the 7 years of plenty, so there would be food during the 7 years of famine. And when we get to Genesis 47, in a story that's not told often enough about Joseph, the first year, the people come to Joseph and say, we're starving, give us your food. Or give us food. And Joseph says, sure, if you give me all your money. And the second year they come and they say, Joseph, we need food. We're starving. And he says, well, if you have no money left, give me all your animals. Now imagine, animals weren't primarily for meat at that time. Sheep and goats provided milk and cheese and yogurt. They provided wool. Cattle were what you broke the ground with. Donkeys were what you moved things, heavy loads with. Joseph takes that the second year. So they're already hampered for the next year. The third year, the people come and say, we don't have any food. And Joseph says, and so the people actually say to Joseph, take us and our land. They know that once they are separated from their land, they are nothing. And they know that without them, the land will not be cared for properly either. So Joseph says, I'll take all your land and I will make you slaves. That's how the people of Israel became slaves. This is how the imperial economy controls food. It is never a gift and there is never abundance. It's an economy of scarcity. But in Exodus 16, when people get out of Egypt, what do they find? But that their God is one who provides food in the wilderness, quails and manna. And it says in the text in Exodus 16 that those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. No matter how much you gathered, you had enough. And hoarding wasn't allowed. When they tried to hoard it, the manna went sour, right? It festered and it got, actually, I think it said it got worms. I did this with the Sunday school class once, and actually it was an Ash Friday release day. And we acted out this story. We used rice crackers as the manna. They gathered it all up and we'd made tents out of blankets and chairs and tables. And they took it into their tents. And I said, okay, I'm going to give you 5 minutes for overnight. What you haven't eaten is going to go bad by morning. So they were eating away. And then I said, okay, if you gathered more than you could eat in 5 minutes, it's gone bad at you. And suddenly all these little kids threw crackers out of their tents going, ew, ew. It was so funny because, of course, that's what happened. But I needed these kids to show me that. So manna in the wilderness is a story of resistance against the slave food economy of ancient Israel. This isn't what God is like. And this continues in the law. Leviticus 25 tells about the year of Jubilee, where the land receives a year of rest, slaves are set free, land is returned to the original farmers, because the land belongs to God. And if you sell the land in Jubilee, you're only selling the crops, because in the year of Jubilee, it returns to the original farmer. It's an economic forgiveness, because economics is tied in with food. And it means not only that wealth is not generational, but also that large-scale industrial agriculture is disrupted every 50 years, right? Over that 50 years, somebody can be buying some people's fields. Usually field was defaulted due to debt. There's not one story in the Hebrew Bible of somebody willingly selling their ancestral land. Almost always it is taken by force, by violence, by debt. And the people who do that, who are amassing all this land every 50 years, have to divest, have to give it back, So industrial agriculture is made impossible. And the slave economy is disrupted every 7 years too. The people who are needed to work industrial agriculture. I mean, it's the same in our own time, right? We can only have these huge crop farms. Well, you're in California, you know this, because migrant workers come in to work on those farms. It doesn't work without migrant workers working at less than the minimum wage. Those are the slaves in our current economy. Now, in the New Testament, this is a story of the rich fool. Luke chapter 12. You might remember this story. A man realized that he had way too much harvest to fit into his current barns. So he built new barns, bigger and bigger barns. And he said, I'm going to rest and take it easy now because I've got all that I want. And that night, it says his soul was demanded from him. This is Mafa Jesus, and this is a picture of what this story would look like in an African context. You might notice all the bowls of rice in the front. The women needed to do that harvest and to bring it in, that the men necessary to be putting the harvest into the bigger and bigger barns that this man has built. You have all the wool in the foreground on the right here. These are bags of wool that have come off the sheep. That's part of your harvest. You have other probably millet here in the front as well. And you'll notice that while the man in the middle who's building these bigger barns, the landowner, is smiling to beat the band, nobody else has a smile on their face. They all know that he has this much food because he's taken it from their mouths and the mouths of their families. This is a picture of somebody doing industrial agriculture. And God is very clear, if you do this, you will lose your soul. Interestingly enough, this could be a picture of Zacchaeus. He was a tax collector who was taking people's land when they defaulted on their taxes, and who was probably doing this kind of building and amassing of wealth. So here's a picture from the same series of Zacchaeus up in the tree. Notice he also has a nice clean white tunic on. It's a similar kind of context, and people are kind of looking suspiciously at him up in the tree. And there's Jesus. Jesus is always in red in this series, telling him to come down. Just imagine Zacchaeus now. If this was Zacchaeus, and what he was doing was not taking all this stuff and putting it into the barns, but giving it away. Right? When Jesus came, Jesus invited Zacchaeus to his house. And before Jesus says anything else, Jesus called Zacchaeus out of the tree. And before Zacchaeus says anything else, or Jesus says anything else, Zacchaeus says, I'm going to give away half of what I've got. And if I've defrauded anybody, I'm going to give them back 4 times of what I took. We tend to think of that as money. But it would have been these kinds of goods. It would have been land that he had taken. So imagine this picture in reverse. All these people with smiles on their faces are turned around and walking away with these baskets. They are taking the rice back. They are taking the wool back. They are taking the fruit back. That's what Zacchaeus did. Zacchaeus knew that when Jesus came, it had implications for food and land and how much people had. So I'm just going to skip real quick to the end of the story. The book of Revelation 22 says this: there was a river flowing from the throne of God through the city, and on the banks of the river, where it was the tree of life, bearing fruit every month of the year. And the leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations. These are 2 pictures by John August Swanson. I liked the picture of this. This is actually a psalm, the one on the left, but all those trees bearing fruit. The picture we have of the new Jerusalem is a river like this river here with all kinds of fruit growing along its sides. The city is something like this, the Anishinaabe forest. This is the forest where I live. And the Anishinaabe people, who are the people of the land on which I now live, these people had fruit on all the trees. They knew where the fruit was in its season, every season of the year. In fact, the moons were often named after those fruits. So the strawberry moon is in June. We're in the wild rice moon right now. This is the picture of the new heaven and the new earth. That kind of abundance year round. That's what Eden was supposed to be and what the new earth will look like, where we will be in our resurrected bodies. Okay, so that's the overview of the biblical story. And I'll take questions at the end. I can't actually see comments when I've got the PowerPoint on. Now, this is the world we live in. This is industrial agriculture, right? Where most of your corn and your soy and your wheat comes from. Only a few species of insects and animals can live in a field like this. And all of them are destroyed or rendered homeless when the harvest happens. This is in the Midwest, or in the West, on the prairies. Results in a barren landscape. Actually, this landscape isn't as barren as a lot of them because it's got a teeny little tractor on it, not those big machines, and there are still trees. But this is what they look like. And oddly enough, it's not just our food. Industrial flower fields are the same kinds of monocultures. Nothing much can live on this kind of a field. And this is what industrial wood harvesting looks like, right? But I'm going to focus mostly on food. So the growing crisis in biodiversity and climate catastrophe is being hastened by the industrial growing of food, flowers, and wood, because habitat's destroyed, there's pesticides and herbicides, and the release of CO2 into the air that used to be stored in the soil. Let me just say something about the herbicide, the pesticides. I just have a statistic here. Sorry, I have notes for this talk, which I'm not using at all. But I have a statistic I just want to share with you. So let me get onto the right page. I'm a little old fashioned. I still use paper. The US applies a staggering 450,000 tons of pesticides. So that's 450,000 tons of pesticides a year. And the federal government recently announced that 2.6 million acres of Montana rangelands, 2.6 million acres in Montana, are to be sprayed with insecticides via crop dusters to contend with native grasshoppers. That those native grasshoppers, of course, have been in abundance because of climate change, right? The collateral damage done to other insects, such as the monarch butterfly and a whole bunch of other butterflies, is incalculable. So it's no wonder that insects are in decline. And of course, that's what's happening on to crops. They're getting rid of the grasshoppers because they're eating our crops. But this is how most of our food meat is produced, right? These are feedlots for cattle. You can see nothing is growing there. There's nothing green. And all the manure from that cattle washes in to the watershed. This is how pigs are industrially raised. That mother pig is in between those bars, so she can't crush her piglets, which means she can never turn around. She can't even turn around. And she's inside on plastic all the time. And those piglets are raised in areas like this. You'll take a look. I want you to notice the floor, because when I show you our pigs, you're going to notice something very different around what those pigs are standing on. So that's a slatted floor. Pigs are meant to root with their noses, to dig. You'll also notice that they have no tails. They've been cut off because when pigs are in these kinds of confined facilities, pigs are quite smart. They're smart like dogs, smarter sometimes, I think. They get bored. and they start to fight. And one of the things they can do is bite each other's tails. So the farmers just cut them off right away. That tells you how bored they are. And this, of course, is how chickens are raised, are meat birds. 8 weeks, never outside, crowded. And again, chickens are created to scratch. These chickens are on plastic. They can never scratch. So it's not just that, and again, both the pigs and the chickens, the waste from these facilities is incredibly polluting because it's not integrated in a larger ecosystem. So there's not just the impact on creation, but there's also the question of how these animals are being treated. Right? What are we saying about these other creatures when they never see the outside? They can never live into the gifts, the giftedness that they have for rooting or scratching or grazing. What happens when those things never happen in an industrial system? What does that say about what we say about the creatures and what we say about the earth? Well, and I guess the next question is, and what do we do to resist these kinds of food systems? So I'm going to stop sharing for just a sec because I don't want to sit on that picture for any longer than I have to. So how can we resist such a system that seems to have this imperial worldview, that we are in a world where we can exploit other creatures, where we can exploit the creation? So part of the resistance is telling another story, right? Telling this story of gift, the story of a web of relation, that these are all earth creatures who are our kin, and that we are the image of God to serve the needs of creation and observe the needs of creation, not exploit it. So at the most basic level, the way to resist this kind of an imperial food system, of course, is to change how you eat, to disconnect, if you can, from the industrial food system. There's no way to serve the land or live lives of food justice without personal commitment and sacrifice to change our involvement. And I'm gonna outline 3 steps. And only one is which is ideal. The first is, if you are able, buy organic food. But of course, this is quite the thing to say. A lot of people can't afford organic food. Organic food can be very expensive. So this is like a small step for people who are able to do so. But organic food, while also done in industrial ways often, is something that, at least at certain points, isn't doing as much harm to creation. Secondly, if you can afford it, buy from local small producers who care for the land. Now, again, that's a if you can afford it thing. It's not an ideal solution. It doesn't walk the full way to food justice, but it's an important step. And part of that buying local is eating local, eating in season, if you can. Eating in season is easier in California than it is where I live. I only eat strawberries in June, or I just planted some ever-bearing plants. So they're actually bearing right now too. But that's it. When they're done, I will not eat another strawberry till next June, because they come from very far away. They come from where you guys are, and it's too much of a footprint. And it feels like that original sin. It's eating out of season, right? To be eating strawberries in January here. Thirdly, and let me say one more thing about that. Also, if you're eating local and sustainably, learn about regenerative farming and permaculture. Learn who's doing that in your area. And thirdly, food sovereignty is what we're actually aiming for. Work for food justice and food sovereignty. And food sovereignty is the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through sustainable methods and it's the right to define their own food, right? So Indigenous peoples in Canada have been saying, we need food sovereignty. We want to produce our own food in our own culturally appropriate ways. This is what is happening with a lot of food justice movements in the Black communities throughout North America, enabling people to grow their own food in their own neighborhoods so that they have food sovereignty. So this is something that's this is the end goal. It's what we're aiming for, is that kind of food sovereignty. But again, those other two steps are good places to start. So we're trying to think about that in relation to our farm as well. There's a American Indigenous woman named Winona LeDuc, who is up in Minnesota. She does a lot with wild rice. And she says that the antidote to globalization is relocalization. So what she says is, go down to the river and pray. Discover the needs of your watershed. And when you discover the needs of your watershed, you can think about what a local food movement would look like in your backyard. So find the people. I mean, you just have to Google local food movements, and it's happening all over the place. Find out who's doing that in your area, and plug in to what they're doing. And almost always these are happening in communities of color. So let me now talk a little bit about our farm and how we've engaged in such practices on our farm, and what this looks like. And I took Mark seriously, so I've got a bunch of photos in our farm. Some of them I went out and took this morning, so they're very, very recent, and some are older. So let me share my screen again. We'll get off that terrible picture of those chickens. So just some background. This is our house. It was built in the 1860s. Just let me point out in this picture, there's a cherry tree in bloom right in the very front. And there are plants growing at the base of that cherry tree. That plant is called comfrey. And comfrey is a dynamic accumulator. It has roots that go deep, deep down into the soil and pull up nutrients from the subsoil. And then those leaves grow very, very quickly. And so we use them as a mulch. We get, in early spring already, in June, we chop down those comfrey leaves, and then all those nutrients from the subsoil are made available to our cherry tree. And then in late August, we chop it down again, and it's all grown up again, and we'll chop it down once more. So that these plants live in symbiosis. So what we practice on this farm is something called permaculture, which is a way of growing that takes its clues from the interrelatedness that we find in the natural world. So how do things happen in the natural world? And it's actually a system of design. So that's just a little design thing. Let me show you a couple other pictures just so you have a flavor of our farm before I go in more deeply. So in this picture here, you'll notice to the right of the house is what we call the woodshed. That's where we keep the wood that we burn. We're wood burning for heat here on our farm, and we cook on our wood burning stove as well. So in the summer we cook on a propane stove, and in the winter we cook over wood. This is the other side of that woodshed, and you'll notice solar panels on the roof that provides all of our electricity. In the right of this picture is a wind tower, which is not functioning. Wind turbines have a lot of moving parts. So at a home level, it's hard to keep them running. We also have a greenhouse because we grow in there to extend the season, and I run an heirloom tomato seedling sale. And so you're seeing some of the gardens here in the front of this picture. And this is just over slightly a pond that we recently put in. We have cabins for interns who come, and then you're looking down over some of the gardens as well. I took this morning, so you can see that the trees are starting to turn. This is looking back up to the house from down below the gardens. So our gardens are on about a 2-acre area of land, though the gardens themselves take up about 1 acre, I'd say. And this is our lower garden looking up towards the house. And you can see on the second floor of the house there, a little greenhouse that we built. And that's for me to start my seedlings in such a way that I don't have to heat another space. So the heat from the house heats that little room in the spring when I start my 2,000 seedlings for my seedling sale. So this, again, you can see the solar panel. So this gives you a little idea of what the farm, what our farm looks like. So how do we plant our gardens? First of all, I've got one more picture here I see. This is what it looks like in winter when we're not planting. And I know that this is never the weather you guys have, so I thought I would just show it to you. And this is when we get to rest. That's what this picture says, rest all over it. So how do we plant? Well, we're careful to be attentive to the needs of the land. We were called to serve and observe. So one of the things we observe, the most basic one is, and you can relate to this, I'm sure, in California, because it's a big concern where you are too, is where does the water go? How can we slow and the water and the soil so that we can keep it? And on land that has never been cultivated, there's lots of divots and pockets and vernal pools and ridges and valleys. So we try to recreate that on the land. So our beds are on contour. You know those contour maps you had in geography class in high school? You know, they had all these moving lines, you know, the curvy lines on them. Well, we find where the contour is on the land. And so our beds curve. So this onion bed is on the curve of the land and it has a swale in front of it. And so do these bean and tomato beds down here. So what happens is that when it rains, and I'll show a picture of that, when it rains heavily, rain gets caught in those swales and it doesn't just run off the land. All of our land is on a slope. And so in the spring in our fields, sometimes you can watch the water just running off the land because it's still frozen when it's raining. Now it pools in these swales and it goes down to our water table and it's made available to the plants. You'll also notice that we have a lot of mulch on the bed. And that's in nature, soil is never bare because as soon as it gets bare, it gets dried up and all the bacteria and things in the soil that need moisture start to die. So we try to keep our soil covered, except for the beans in this picture. Beans like a bacon hot, so we just leave the mulch off there. Here's a picture from the top of that garden. This is taken in the spring one year. That's the same year that from the picture you just saw. Now we have hand-built trellises that the beans are growing up. And you can see how the flow of the swale goes in those gardens. In the front, these are our grapevines taking over a lilac bush, but we like grapes more than we like lilacs, so we're we're letting it happen. So this is what it looks like in the spring when you have your spring rains, and you'll notice that those swales are full of water. So the water's not running off the land. So this is one thing we do. We just pay attention to where the water goes. But also in nature, you'll notice that edges are places of diversity. Right, the edge of a forest, the edge of a pond, where soil meets air is a place of diversity. So in the natural world, it's never really very flat. The ground goes up and down when you're on a hike, right? Because edges are important. So we make beds, raised beds. And so you'll notice here in this picture, these are the swales naturally create raised beds. So the soil is up against air more than it would be if it was all flat. But also we create beds that have more edge in terms of shape. So this is a keyhole bed. This is also a design that conserves space. So if you stretch this bed out straight, it would take up more space than when you curve it around and just have a little path up the middle. This is the bed for early spring. You can see cucumbers, there's tomatoes and leeks, but you're not seeing the leeks, you're just seeing the weeds. In this picture, you can see the leeks because we weeded and mulched. And you can also notice that we've done a lot of, again, mulching and companion planting. So the nasturtiums that are growing around the cucumbers on the right of this picture, they repel the squash and the cucumber beetles. So planting them together helps helps the plants. This pond we just finished this year, and that's why this is a celebratory picture with our friends. I think I might be able to make that a little bigger. I don't know. No, I can't. That's our friends Claudia and Henry, who are from Colombia and spent the summer with us at our farm, and Sophia. And we have just finished putting the rocks around the pond in this picture, which is why Henry has his hand in the air to show how strong he is. This is a place of incredible diversity. We have all kinds of frogs. We have the blue darner dragonfly, and Brian informed me yesterday morning that a blue heron has found us, which means A, it's very diverse, and secondly, he's eating our frogs, which is not a great thing. So just a couple more pictures again. Yeah, the frog, I'm excited by the heron and sad for the frogs. That's what the rocks are for, though. The rocks in the pond are to create places for the frogs to hide from the blue heron and also from raccoons. So we have mulch on everything. Again, this is the comfrey around a fruit tree. You can see how tall it gets around those trees. These other, the peas in this picture on the right provide shade for the lettuce. So we know the lettuce likes it cooler. So the peas provide some shade. The marigolds help repel nematodes from the tomatoes. So all of these are knowing what your plants like and growing it together. But so more companion plants. This picture shows the aphids on the nasturtiums instead of on my green peppers. And I know I'm getting short on time, so I'll just run through these a little more quickly. On our farm, we also try to honor the gifts that various animals bring. So the only way that nature has to move fertility uphill is by grazing, is by animals, right? Fertility flows downhill with water. So animals are what moves it uphill by eating things and then pooping higher up on the landscape. These are our cows. We use the fence to mimic predators and do intensive rotational grazing. So they move to fresh pasture every single day. In the wild, grazing creatures are forced by wolves or other coyotes, foxes, to keep moving. That means they always eat fresh grass and they spread their fertility around. So we move our cattle every single day. So compare this to the picture of the feedlot that you saw. These cows are excited every day. Sometimes when we move them to a new strip of land, they run along and they kick up their heels. They're so excited. And then they start eating. We put the cows this time last year next to pasture next to the pigs, and that cow is ready to bolt because he's scared to death of those pigs who are just very curious. Our pigs also love to root. And they eat, pigs are supposed to have 80% vegetation in their diet. So this is what they look like when we get our pigs in the spring. They're on grass, they eat pasture, and you can see in the bottom of this picture how much rooting this pig has done. You can tell their noses are always dirty because they're just kind of nosing around. And what they do is they clear areas for us. We move them every year. This is this year's pigs. Odysseus, because he got out and ran away the first day. His wife Penelope and Francis, whose last name is Bacon. I hate to say it. Francis Bacon. You can see how they've cleared this one area, and in the back there, we blocked that back area off so it could grow up green. And this is just before we moved them to that back area, so they have more green area to root around in. And then this is what we planted in the area where they were last year. We created a wildflower meadow. We planted fruit trees and shrubs that will grow into a bit of a food forest. So they are creating, they're turning areas that are just grass into this kind of diversity. And I just thought I'd show you our chicks. Our chicks get to root around in the grass. Our chicks, this one's a little blurry, but there's a little black chicken under her wing, a chicken on her back, and a little white chicken coming out of her front. I like this picture. The little chick under the hen's wing is the rooster on the left. That's what he grew up to be. So our chickens, do a lot of digging around. This is actually their coop. They have elderberries in their coop, and they fertilize the elderberries, and when some of the berries fall, the chickens get to eat them. So they do us a favor. They keep our elderberry trees healthy. We have no other elderberry trees this big and healthy for our elderberries. And the chickens are just doing what they do naturally. And we get the reward for that. This is just a picture of our ducks. So we try to respect our animals. The result is that we have these kinds of insects, like I showed you at the beginning. I took these on all of the plants that we've planted for other reasons, and they're all around our garden. And because we have insects, we have birds and these other creatures. But we also treat the human community well. So these are some friends of ours who come up to the farm to help out. Cynthia is hand pressing cider, which everybody loves using the hand press for cider. We don't get a ton of cider every year. We get enough to eat when we have guests drink, but it's human scale work. Same with Sophia, who's pondering this trellis she's been making. We make our trellises. People love making trellises because it's very creative to think of how to do it. So again, it's human scale work, and we ensure that our work, there's time for Sabbath. So there's always time to take delight in creation. The pigs, Cynthia with the cows. Who are we when we answer these questions? We are kin with other creatures, servants of the land, and image bearers of the Creator. And where are we? In an abundant creation, a place of gift and a place of relation. And that means that how we view creation is very different than the industrial agriculture that surrounds us. Okay, that's the end. My apologies that ran a bit long, but that's partly because I started late, and I'm sorry for
Sylvia,
that.
we have just a couple of minutes for questions. We want to make sure that if there are any burning questions for you, that folks are able to ask them.
First of all, thank you for your talk. That was really, really, really interesting. Before I came to LA over the pandemic, I spent a couple years with my family, kind of in the west of Wyoming near Nebraska. Mm-hmm. And I met a bunch of farmers there who had big agriculture, industrial farms, and a bunch of farmers who kind of had these small farms that they kind of hand tended. And I noticed that the small farmers produced great food, but they couldn't produce a lot of it, so they had to sell it really, really expensively, and only rich people could buy it. Whereas the big industrial farmers could sell their food really, really cheaply for everyone. So my question for you is, how do we take the practices that you're developing and make sure that we can feed everyone with it? Because there are a ton of us on this earth. And since industrial farming got invented, the population has just been growing and growing and growing and growing. And no one has enough to eat anyway right now. Thank you very much, Sylvia.
Okay, that's a great question. Two things. There is somebody who in Wisconsin who is actually doing something called restoration agriculture and showing how you can do. His name is Mark Shepard with 1 P, showing how you can do large scale sustainable farming that can feed everyone. But I think it's also important to say that it's actually a myth that industrial farming is feeding the world. And I'm putting a link that I don't know if everybody will be able to see, but I just put a link in the chat to an article from The Guardian from a couple of days ago, talking about how small farmers actually feed most of the people in the world. And it's the in North America, industrial agriculture is able with huge food subsidies to undercut small farmers in North America. But in the rest of the world, small farmers are feeding people in Africa, in India, in Asia. And so I've put a link in the chat. You can look that up. There's also a book by Ellen Davis called, so you can also just go to the Guardian and type in, small farmers. This all has to do with the upcoming global UN summit on agriculture, which has been hijacked by big agriculture. There's also a book by Ellen Davis called Scripture, Culture, Agriculture. She has a lot of these statistics in her book too, and it's a biblical reading of agriculture. And so that's worth looking at too. But I think you will find actually that in neighborhoods like in Detroit and other places where neighborhood farming has really taken off, it's feeding an enormous number of people. So it's actually, I think it's a myth. That, sorry, I feel like I'm in a Muppet movie. It's a myth that big agriculture is feeding everybody.
We have time for 2 more brief questions.
Yes, earlier you indicated that if you practice industrial agriculture, you've lost your soul. Do you think the Hutterites have lost their souls?
Yeah, the Hutterites have really ramped things up. I don't think I put it quite that way. I said this story suggests that that this man's soul was demanded from him for practicing this. But there is a certain industrialization that characterizes Hutterite communities, not just around agriculture, but around how they raise children and how they organize their community, that I think does have some problems. That's all I will say. Not
One
knowing.
final question.
Hi, and thank you for the talk. My question is, with the price of organic vegetation, is it really that expensive, or is it that they can get that amount of money because they put the label organic on it? How much of that is actual cost of production versus the cachet of saying I buy organic?
That's a good question. The folks I know around here who are selling organic are just making it by. It still isn't the true cost of the food. But some of the large industrial, and this is why I said organic isn't necessarily the answer, the large industrial organic places probably are taking more than they need to cover their costs. Yes. So both and.
Well, I know we've only scratched the surface, and if you if you'd be willing to maybe send us maybe a little resource list of some of the things that you've talked about, and even maybe something about the possibility of I know that you have visitors coming to the farm sometimes and that can spend a certain amount of time there. Maybe some information about how we could find out more about that. Maybe that's available on your website, but maybe if you could just jot down a few little things to send it to us that we can put on our resource list, including maybe, Sylvia, any other resources that you think might be helpful to continue this conversation, which has been really fruitful and just amazing. And I know I would love to come visit your farm sometime because it just seems like a beautiful place. And so we thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to keeping in relationship with you. It's so wonderful to have you with us again, Sylvia. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And can I say one more thing, Mark?
Sure.
Yeah. If you want to know more about small farming, actually, there's a book by Leah Penniman, and it's called Farming While Black. And it is an incredible resource for Black and Indigenous farming movements in the States. She's in New York. So I'd look that up, but I'll put it on the resource list too. Okay, thank you. And I'm very sorry I was late, and this was wonderful.
Oh, it was wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.